Hello, and welcome to Chaotic Insights, where I break down the TV show Chaotic, and today we'll be talking about Season 2, Episode 11, War Beasts. So grab a snack, start your laundry, and we'll dive right in. Episode summary. Kaz runs in on Peyton telling a story to alert the group that there is a fierce new creature battling in the Churldrome. They watch the end of the Blasmatan versus Bareth Beyond match, and at the end of the match, the player with the Blasmatan scan broadcasts that he will be auctioning off an extra Blasmatan scan in the port court. The auction boils down to Christella and Peyton wins with an offer of any 20 scans from his deck. Peyton then goes to battle with his new Blasmatan scan, but is out of control with a recklessness stat of 25. So Peyton loses the match. Then the auctioneer swings by and reveals that the auction was Christella and Clay's idea, but if Peyton wants to get his Plasmatan under control, he would need a Conjurer card, and that he would be able to find one near Rao Pasak. So, Kaz and Peyton journey to the desert and find Fivarth. Fivarth reveals the history of conjuring and reveals that he himself is a conjurer. So Peyton gets his scans, then challenges Clay to a 2v2 Betadrome match. Peyton wins the match with his unexpected strategy, and that's the episode. So let's dive into analysis. Well, let's start off with this episode does get cut off on the official Chaotic YouTube channel, so I haven't seen this episode in completion in quite some time, right? So it was kind of like watching an episode again, like with fresh eyes, maybe like for the first time. My first reaction was, wow, there is a lot of plot crammed into just one episode here, and that there is. So let's dive into that a little bit. We've got 3 chaotic battles and an intermission for a Mopedian scan quest, and we get some backstory about the War Beasts and Mopedians, and that is a lot of plots. That is a lot of information in one tiny 22-minute episode. So now, even though we have a lot of plot, it doesn't necessarily mean it's all sequitur. And what I mean by that is like my preference in plot structure is like a series of dominoes. The next thing happens because the last event occurred, and it's a series of cause and effect. And this plot has some of that, but I do think we could strengthen this plot a little bit by fine tuning some of the causation. For example, Peyton wins his match against Clay because of his Magician's Liar strategy, which is smart and clever, but nothing earlier on in this episode inspires that winning strategy. We do get the cause and effect of like Peyton challenges Clay to a match because he gets a Conjurer scan, and he gets a Conjurer scan because Connor, the auctioneer character, told him about it. And the Connor character tells Peyton about it because he felt bad working with Christella and Clay to swindle Peyton out of cards. And he felt bad because he did do that. He set a trap with Christella and Clay by showing off his Plasmatan card in the Drome and then holding an auction, right? And so we get, like, working backwards, we get that cause and effect, like, to the beginning of the episode. But it's just that final piece of, like, Peyton winning the match feels disconnected to me in this A-plot story structure because it's the only one that doesn't have a domino fall into it, right? Using the Magician's Liar strategy effective, and like it's in the world that we live in, like we understand, we've seen a Magician's Liar before probably, and like we understand what it does and how it works and why he would do that, but it's not explicitly like within the realm of what we're talking about in this episode. So it's a clever strategy, but it's like it is unexpected. It's thinking outside of the box, which is Peyton's, specialty. But right, with the whole rest of the A plot having this clear cause and effect structure, for me it would strengthen this episode to have that final winning strategy be looped into it. If the final winning strategy he learned about with Fivarth, right, if he got a piece of information there and then brought it to the drone. Whereas, he didn't do that. It's still a good story, but I think if we just fine-tuned it a little bit, it could have gone the extra mile. There's also a beef plot here, which we've done this story structure before, where a character just like tells a story in the middle of the episode. I'm thinking interests. I'm thinking the Rasmus and Maxor backstory thing. I'm thinking Hotan and Vidav, right? There's a couple episodes where like we have the start of a story, intermission time, we're doing a history lesson, and then we're finishing out our A story. And that's the way this episode is structured, right? Our A story is Peyton with the Plasmatan scan, and then we have a brief little intermission for our history lesson about, war beasts, conjurers, and all that. And then, we take that information and we go into our third act, which, is Peyton versus Clay. But in this B story, since we have seen it, I do appreciate the exposition that Fivarth lays in this episode because the information that he tells and the story that he tells actually does give us a lot of valuable information about war beasts, about conjurers, about like the status of Mopedian like social economic history. And I think that's interesting and important. And I always I think the political socioeconomic aspects of Chaotic are some of the most interesting things to dive into. And so I really do appreciate Fivarth's story here, where he shares some history with us. Now, something else I want to talk about is this mysterious Bareth Beyond opponent in the first match. I would like to theorize that Bareth Beyond is Clay, because they don't show who that character is, right? We know that whoever is battling Connor in this match is somebody, but they don't show who it is. And so I would like to theorize it's Clay because in this episode they make it clear that it was a setup, right? A setup showing off the Plasmatan card to cause the auction to swindle Peyton, which, is fine. But why would Connor do that with just any old person when he could be doing it with Clay? However, Clay being the opponent in this drum match is just a theory. A game theory, but it's just a theory. And, it being Clay could have caused suspicion, but because they never show the opponent, my argument was going to be Bareth Beyond is Clay's signature creature. And then I thought about it for a little bit, and I don't think Bareth Beyond is Clay's signature creature, right? Like, Maxor is Tom's signature creature, and, Kaor is Kaz's signature creature. Tartarak is Tartareker's signature creature. There's, you get this routine of there's one creature that you can always expect to be on somebody's team, whether they've built a relationship with them or they just feel more comfortable with them or that's their good card, that's the powerhouse of their deck. And I don't think it's Bareth Beyond for Clay. His signature creature is actually Von Blue, right? And so my question is, why do I have this association with Bareth Beyond and Clay? And the answer is, I don't know. So I kind of looked into it, and on the Chaotic Wiki, Clay does use Bareth Beyond in episode 8 and episode 18. So he does use this creature, but that's not a lot of sticking points for it to stick in my mind. Versus Clay uses Von Blue in Duel, and we see Clay with Von Blue and in pair 'em together all the time. So this is more of a question for you. Who do you think is Clay's signature creature? And do you think it would strengthen the story if that initial opponent was Clay? Or do you think that would be too obvious in that Clay and Christella were playing in Peyton's face? In this first battle, though, they do make it a point to emphasize Plasmatan's scale. He is huge, both in the battle and in the drum itself once one of the creatures is coded, right? When Plasmatan is turning back into a human, we have this giant, huge creature that turns back into a normal-sized human. And so they really emphasize the scale of Plasmatan is huge. And I think that it's interesting having this War Beast episode directly after Gigantopolis because they both emphasize a vastness in scale. Plasmatan is huge. Gigantopolis is huge. And so having one right after another in terms of sequencing is interesting to me because of, right, they're amping up the scale of things in Param. Just one is in the present, War Beasts, and one is in the past, Gigantopolis. Now, thematically, this episode, Sarah drives home, be careful what you trade for, make sure that you're informed going into the deal that you're going into, right? Was Plasmatan worth 20 of Peyton's best cards? Who's to say, right? Only Peyton can, evaluate the value that a Plasmatan card has to him. And, maybe it was worth it. But Peyton traded recklessly and got tricked because he dove into this deal without knowing who Plasmatan is, knowing that it requires a certain strategy to use War Beasts, right? He just went blindly into this deal and made some mistakes along the way. So I think there's a theme to be pulled out about, if you do a little bit more research before jumping into decisions, right, it could have saved him some hassle. And then I'm sure there's also another theme to be pulled out of like the War Beast backstory, but that's more of like a historic retelling than the current narrative of like battling. And so like the Conjurers did face oppression and they were banned, so there is commentary in that. But the lesson of this episode specifically, I think, focuses on the A plot, which is do your research, make sure you're informed, don't make rash decisions, especially when trading goods and services, right? Know your worth, know your value. What can you bring to the table? So I think that's interesting for this episode. Let's move on to lore. So this is a big lore episode. The title of the episode is indeed what we get a lot of the lore on, and that is war beasts. So, like number one, we learn that they exist and that they are decently rare at Chaotic because our main characters are unfamiliar with them before this encounter, right? Getting a Plasmatian card was just like the next big thing, right? It was kind of unseen in the dromes, just like Olmageddon was, right? There was kind of this rush of like who was going to get the next War Beast. And so we also learn some backstory about, we learn about the first conjurers who dreamed of creating something powerful and new, some beings to protect the Mopedians and help conquer their enemies. So war beasts weren't created defensively, they were created both as a defense and an offense, right? They wanted to conquer people, and so they wanted strong beasts to do that. They also could use the beasts for defense. And they achieved this by summoning musical essences and drawing on the four elements. So this is the first time we hear about musical essences, which like could be a thing. Like how a proton is in an atom, maybe there's a musical essence in a music. But Fitharth could also be using this as like a turn of phrase for being like in tune with nature, right? We're in tune with the musical essences and the four elements, right? It's not just a thing, it's also like an experience. So I thought that was noteworthy of like what is a musical essence? Is it like a real something? Like is it an ingredient in music? And they're like using this ingredient to help create war beasts? Or is it, a turn of phrase, a cultural thing? We're tuning into the four elements. Does that mean like we're tuning into nature, or are they like physically summoning the powers that they have? You know what I mean? There's kind of a blurry line there. But eventually they do succeed in creating war beasts and they conjure them. And so the first war beasts were reckless and uncontrollable, so the nobles banned war beasts and conjuring, right? So we have this like first wave of conjuring where they invent it, the inventors, and then their invention is too dangerous, it's uncontrollable, too powerful, that, fear happens and they just outlaw it. They're like, this cannot be allowed. And so there goes a time without conjurers and without war beasts, until the underworlders were almost successful in conquering the Mopedians. So a creature named Adolmo studies the ancient texts, and Adolmo learns how to conjure, but also how to control the war beasts. So he helped them reclaim the Mopedian territory from the underworlders using a war beast. So let's break that down a little bit. The Underworlders, this is interesting lore in and of itself. The Underworlders were almost successful conquering the Mopedians. So, this tribe dispute has been going on for quite a while. And we know that, like, even in the present day, Underworlders raid the Mopedian territory because that's how they got the invisibility mechanisms for the KOR Commando episode. But at some point in history, Underworlders almost won. They were so close to doing it. But then this Mopedian named Adolmo, he studied the ancient texts that were left behind, right? War beasts were banned, but that doesn't mean like the information on them was lost, right? The information was still there, and he studied it, and he learned what they learned, and then he, added a little bit of his own stuff. He learned how to control them, and he used that to reclaim Mopedian territory. Now, normal Mopedians became suspicious and envious of the new conjurers, so they chose to live in secret and in fear of being banned once more. But these conjurers, we learn, are ready for the next time war beasts are needed. That's the story that we get from Fivarth, and truthfully, I believe him. I feel like he is a reliable narrator because not only is it his history, like he's talking about his own people, but he's also lived it. Like he knows what the experience is now of, he's living in secret, he's living in fear of being banned, of being banished because he's a conjurer, even though like being a conjurer isn't illegal anymore. You know what I mean? So I like trust his story and trust that he's giving us what he knows. Whether, the lore or history got warped over time, like I don't know. Like he could be, just telling oral history that has warped over time, but I think Fivarth is telling us what he believes is true. So what's interesting is that we do have these two waves of conjurers. We have the first wave that was inventors, and then the second wave was founded by Adomo, who like brought conjuring back and taught others what he learned. Right? He is like because he learned something and he went and became like the head teacher of war beasts and how to control them. And so now there's like this new wave of conjurers who know how to conjure safely and how to control the war beasts. And right now, currently in Mopedian like law, conjurers are not outlawed, but there is still a prejudice or stigma associated with it because, with great power comes great responsibility, and people are afraid of what they don't understand. And so the conjurers living in secret is like a symptom of that. They have great power and therefore great responsibility, but people who aren't conjurers don't understand like what it is that they do, right? And so there is still this culture of fear surrounding war beasts. So obviously Fivarth is not like ashamed of being a conjurer because he is willing to share this information and he shows off Uberon, who is the war beast that he conjures. And Clay also has an Uberon's can, which means Fivarth also showed off this war beast to him. So he's not particularly ashamed of being a conjurer, but he is choosing to live a more private life to detach himself from, the stigma that still lingers in Mopedian society. And I just think it's an interesting social dynamic because within the Mopedians, right, conjuring is like a secret society of passing down powerful information and it's being passed down, it's being taught, but it is like in secret. And people who conjure war beasts, they at this point they are like defenders, like they're ready to use the war beast when need be, but they're no longer going on the offensive, right? Originally the intent with war beast was to be an offensive weapon so that they could go conquer other peoples, and that's no longer happening because the concept of being a conjurer has this social aspect to it that is causing them to hide, right? The Mopedian army isn't just calling up the war beasts and being like, hey, we're going to go invade, right? So the social history of it has negated the original intent. And now with like war beasts being controllable, they definitely could do that. They definitely could use the war beasts as an offensive measure, but they're not because of the history associated with it. And isn't that interesting, right? They give us just this little bit of information, but we really are able to dive into some of these structures at play, right? If they gave us a little more information, we'd know more and we'd be able to dive into more, discover more. But that's kind of all we get. Like we learn about this history and we understand that there's some sort of stigma around conjuring, and so they're choosing to live separate lives. And now on to something else. In this episode, we do get a lot of information on war beasts in Param, and that's what like Fivarth was talking about. That's the story with Adoma. But we also do get a lot of information about war beasts as a trading card game and the mechanics used within that. And I think that's also super interesting, and how this episode adapts and incorporates the trading card game lore into like the narrative structure, I think, you know, is interesting. So let's talk about it. For example, the concept of recklessness, right? The concept of recklessness, the concept of conjurers to help war beasts get under control are both game mechanics used in the chaotic card game, where conjurers reduce the amount of recklessness in a war beast. on their team. And they're using that concept, and then they applied this, narrative structure to it of in the history, conjurers learned how to control war beasts. So now in the game, having a conjurer on your team is the only way to be able to control your war beast in the drome. And I think that's a nice through line. But let's talk about this concept of recklessness, because what is recklessness but a word? And here's the thing, it's also a game mechanic. And so in the game, recklessness is a term for damage a creature inflicts on itself whenever it uses an attack. But as a word, it just means like lack of caution. And so in this episode, they keep calling war beasts reckless. And what they mean by that is the game mechanic. Like they mean Plasmatan has a recklessness of 25, which means every time he attacks, he loses 25 energy. But if you don't know that, then you don't know that. And so, like, you could just watch this episode and think they mean recklessness as, like, dangerous or uncontrollable or, like, cautionless, right? You're watching this episode and you're going, ugh, war beasts are so reckless. And they're showing that, like, Plasmatan is uncontrollable, he is cautionless without the help of a conjurer. Now, he is also inflicting damage on himself with the game mechanic in terms of recklessness because he doesn't have a conjurer, but that's not like explicitly stated. They explicitly state that Plasmatan has a recklessness of 25, but they don't explain the mechanic. And so like this is an example of understanding the game helps you understand the TV show because they're adapting the game mechanic into a narrative. And that's one thing like when I used to watch this episode, I didn't know that. I didn't know this game mechanic specifically. And so when they're saying, oh, Plasmatan is so reckless, they're like, yeah, he's out of control. But like watching it now, I'm like, oh, they mean like he's so reckless as every time he does an attack, he inflicts damage on himself, which I do think changes your perception of the episode, understanding this mechanic and versus not understanding it. Because what is recklessness? A word. But I do think it's interesting they apply the game mechanic into the storytelling, and that's something that they're doing a lot this season, is that they're really trying to expand the connection between the cards and the show. They're trying to build this relationship with these new cards, new strategies, and like new releases into the plot of the show. So for example, the Rasnus storyline was a direct adaptation of the Danian infection mechanic, the same way that this episode is a direct adaptation of like the War Beast Conjurer mechanics. And even though they kind of like gloss over it, that is what is happening. They also show off the overworld library in this episode, which again they don't like specifically point out, but Plasmatan is battling in Kira City, and then he like stumbles into the library, and then his tornado arms uses the books. You know what I mean? He's using the books to fight with, or like to create chaos around him, and it's something that like they don't point out of like, oh, we're gonna battle at the library, but they do have like a specific establishing shot with the same silhouette of the card, and that's what they're doing. They're connecting the cards to the show. And they do the same thing with Mirage locations in this episode. There's the commercial cliffhanger where, oh, this location is like firing at us, and then after the commercial break, it disappears because it was a mirage. That's connecting the cards to the show. There's the concept of mirage locations in the card game, and they're introducing it to the lore, to the world of Param. And when they're looking for a conjurer, they see a mirage location. And that canonizes mirage locations in the storytelling, in Param the World, in the TV show, even without explicitly touching on it. The same way they do the Overworld Library, they canonize this card in the show without explicitly touching on it. They're just showing that it exists and that it is incorporated in the world without being like, here's an episode on the Overworld Library. You know what I mean? And so what it is, synergy. Cards, TV show, cards, online trading game, in-person trading game. It's a whole community experience. On to fun facts and other notes. On the menu today we have, it's either a cupcake or a muffin. It's kind of hard to tell, and so it's one of the two. We also have a burger with no plate or wrapper. It's just sitting on the table. And we also get a side of like pickle slices. which this is, I would say, one of the stranger combinations we've seen, not because it's weird to have a side of pickles and not because it's weird to like have a burger, but because it's a burger with no plate or no wrapper. Normally, if you're eating a burger without a plate, it like comes wrapped or it has like the thing that you grabbed onto. Like you're not just setting down your burger on the table. You're setting it on a napkin or something. This burger's fully on the table. A side of pickles is just very specific. You know, sure, you can get a side of pickles. That's not like something on the menu. You have to ask for that, I'm assuming. And I just wanted to point it out. The next thing in my notes section is Connor, who is the auctioneer. He says the auction is going to be at the snack pork cart, which is interesting because why is he differentiating pork court with the word snack? What's the difference between the snack pork court and like the normal pork court? So I'm wondering, is there another pork court that like doesn't serve food? Are there regions within the pork court of like the snack pork court is this area and like the viewing pork court is this area? Do they differentiate it that way? Who's to say? But I think his language seemed intentional, and then, of course he had a crowd, so it worked. So showing up at the snack pork court, you know, that's where the snacks are. We're assuming. One other thing I wanted to point out is Christella and Clay. They've always had beef with Tom, and Kaz, and Peyton, and Sarah, but most of their plots entangle somehow to put them at odds. But this episode, to me, it really shows Christella and Clay like going out of their way to scam Peyton, which is in character, but I think is a little extra rude. So my final thoughts on this episode are there is like so much episode in this like itty bitty episode. It's like jam packed in there. And so I wish we were able to dive more into things. Like I would have expanded on the War Beast history. Like I have questions about that. I would have expanded on Mirage location or the concept of recklessness or, highlighting the overworld library. Like they did these things very casually, very synergetically, if you will. Um, but I do think like each of those things deserves their time to shine. And I don't know if all of them are given time to shine in this episode. That's like, that's personal critique. And here's the thing. You can only critique what's there and you can't critique what's not there. And I like can't critique this episode for not diving into these things more because they didn't do that. But I think what I'm critiquing is it felt like with this jam-packed episode, it felt like a lot of concepts crammed into one place that we didn't get time to explore each and every concept. And that's what I'm thinking about. And so really, when I watched this episode, I thought that's a good, fine episode. But picking it apart, I'm enjoying it more and more, right? The history of War Beasts, picking that apart, I'm enjoying it more and more. Thinking about, the way they constructed the episode of, Peyton sees the plasmatan, he gets it, he tries it, he fails, he learns something, he succeeds, right? That's a very, like, linear plot to me. And you also just have to admit, like, the concepts of War Beasts, that's just awesome, right? Giant war beast. Plasmatana has tornadoes for arms. That's cool. Like objectively, that's cool. And so that gets this episode major points. Um, Uberon, giant. He's cool. And then there's other war beasts that we don't get to see necessarily in this episode. They're cool. War beasts are cool. And so that also gets, a lot of points with me. And so this episode, I think, has a big impact. It's memorable. It has a lot of information. And even this time around, if I thought, it needed just like a little bit of fine tuning, or I thought we could dive into each of these concepts a little further, I think at a baseline, this episode is still pretty good. And it's just like if you clicked those things into place, it would have elevated it into the stratosphere. But what we have currently is good. It's a good episode. I had a good time. I learned some things. And we get to see our favorite villains and our favorite heroes. So, what more could you want? With that, let me know what you think. If you have any theories, if you have any concepts, let me know. And with that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.